This is Small Talk with Elise, episode 15. Today we are continuing on to part 2 from our last episode. If you missed part 1 of this, check out episode 14. This episode will be about religious faith crises, the CES Letter, excommunicated former LDS Bishop Sam Young, a YouTube channel called Mormon Stories, and how Jordan Peterson helps to form a new perspective on Christian beliefs.
But the thing that I think where Mormons and Gnostics sort of touch base on is that Jesus provides like this ultimate example by which we should imitate, or by which we should orient our lives and imitate that figure.
And I think there's another part. So like obviously none of Joseph Smith's theology that he brought is not going to be same. An exact carbon copy of Gnosticism, because first of all, Gnosticism is not a theology, I think. But I think there was a really strong point made in in the Pharisee talk, and it was kind of connecting the resilience and kind of fear of creeds that we have in the LDS Church, and that is kind of really similar to that point that that view that Jesus came and he kind of said, just because you're checking off this list of how many steps you're walking on the Sabbath and you didn't touch any dirty Samaritans or dead bodies this week, that makes you a good person, right? And he was kind of throwing out the list and saying, well, actually, there's not 10 commandments. You can summarize them into 2 basic principles: love God and love your neighbor with all your heart, might, mind, and strength, right? And so I kind of see this connection between the anti-creeds nature of Mormonism and that view of Jesus playing that role in upturning those creeds.
So great observation. I think one of the themes that ran within that talk and within all the talks actually at the conference, which I thought was really interesting, was the point that Nicholas was trying to make. He's the speaker that gave that speech about the Pharisees. One of the things that he points out was that when God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to Joseph Smith in 1820, a lot of Mormons, I guess, make what's the word I'm looking for? They sort of like sloppily say, "Oh well, God told Joseph Smith that all the churches are wrong."
Yeah.
But in reality, what he said was, "Oh well, all their creeds are an abomination unto me."
Mm-hmm.
And so,
interesting.
Nicholas' point, and one of his points in that talk was, "Oh well, we have to get over this whole creed type of thing." And he even went so far as to say, "Well, creed, like you have a creed, let's say like a proposition of a declaration of faith, but other things can serve as a type of creed, like let's say a list of commandments, or maybe your temple recommend questions." And he said, "Well, hold on, God specifically told us to not abide by creeds, so let's be more careful in the future and see if we can break free from that type of framing when we approach gospel topics or a religious life."
And one of those creeds he pointed out was a prophet, actually. And he said, okay, let me back this up. I'm a dedicated member of the church, perfect testimony, And then he said, but I want to make a point, right? And he was like, what if a prophet could serve as a creed? And I think his definition of creed was something along the lines of, if someone tells you, just do this, just follow this, and you'll be fine, like you'll be saved. That's kind of how he defined a creed, right? And a lot of, I would say, our fellow religionists would ascribe to that, like, oh, because we sing it in private, right? It's like follow the prophet.
Follow the prophet.
You won't go
it's
astray.
almost like that creepy brainwashing stuff. Follow the prophet. You're starting
and they play that with like
starting to foam out the side of your mouth or something.
and they always play that clip with people at General Conference raising their hand, and it looks like we're all like,
like, whoa, holy cow!
But but out of all seriousness, I think there's a good point there. And I was actually really interested to see how my like pretty orthodox friend would respond to that. So I asked him like afterwards, I was like, what'd you think of like all of that? That's why I asked him like, did you think it was like apostate and stuff?
He fell
like,
asleep at that part, didn't he?
No, he wasn't asleep.
Okay.
He said,
I saw him fall asleep during a portion of my speech, and I even called him out afterwards. I'm like, dude, come on. And he's like, no, I had a long day at work yesterday. I'm like, that's right. Mine was fun. Right.
He had to drive all the way down from Salt Lake last week.
Shoot.
He thought the event was in Salt Lake, and I told him like 2 hours or 3 hours before. I was like, dude, it's in Springville, Provo.
Yeah, South
Springville.
Provo.
So he had to drive down. He was pretty tired. But
what
he
did
told
he say
me
then?
his view was, oh my goodness, I learned so much from that. I am the Pharisee. I never thought that. Like I am actually the people that Jesus was criticizing. I need to focus on the real stuff and stop focusing so much on all the rules. And so he totally saw that as a good point. He was like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like, yeah, prophets could totally serve as a creed to some people. That's totally true.
So when you say prophets could serve as a creed, just so I'm clear, like in the sense that you're saying, well, as long as you follow the prophet, you'll be fine. Or we heard what the prophet said, just do it and you'll be fine. Like that type of idea.
Exactly. Which would be in opposition to, President Nelson just came to BYU and he said, specifically, he said, don't just trust us for our word. Like he said, make sure you get your own personal confirmation of that. And don't just trust us blindly. Like you should think about what we're saying. You should ponder it. You should flesh it out. And then of course you could put in the terms, they say, get a spiritual confirmation. I personally, I don't know very many people who actually do that. And if they try, it's pretty hard just to get a spiritual confirmation for anything really. Mm-hmm. But I like that point because I think that's what the Gnostics and Mormons have in common again is this personal experience, right, of the religion. It has to be a very personal thing. It has to be, that's where personal revelation comes in. It's in a little bit in opposition and tension to the creeds or the top down kind of approach to religion. Would you say?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
What are your guys' thoughts on? So, I mean, I get that, but to some extent, there is also kind of an argument that before you can get to that point where you're focusing on this higher idea, this ideal, and this meaning, this optimization, you have to adhere to some type of creeds that you don't really understand why. But when you do that, you'll get to a point eventually where you could kind of get there. But for most people speaking, you have to just do these little dogmatic things here and there, and that'll get you in a good enough position where you might be able to get through the bushes and the weeds and say, oh, okay, now I know what I have to do. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Alejandro, go ahead.
I think there's definitely a developmental progression when it comes to adhering to a system of ethics or a religious system. You can't expect people who are novices, let's say, in the faith to know instantly what it means to be like Christ and to imitate him. But you start out with the list of rules or whatever the goal might be. Come to church every Sunday might be a good starting point. Or write what's the seminary answers? Read your scriptures, go to church, and pray. Right.
Yep.
You start with those, and then you can start. I don't want to say delving deeper, but you can get a better insight into what you're supposed to do as time goes on. And
so I've heard this as milk before meat, right? The only point I would add to that, this is what Greg Prince said, is, well, where's the meat? Right? Because typically the answer is, like, you're totally right. There is something like, if you're investigating the church, you probably want to start with the basic stories. If I threw out 5 different accounts of Joseph Smith's vision at you on my first lesson, I don't even know how you would interpret that, right?
Yeah.
That's a good objection that you bring up.
But like, I think there is a progression, and you have to start basic. But if that deeper stuff is not available, which I would actually say a lot of times, people don't feel comfortable discussing it at church, which is a problem.
Well, here's one way to look at it, and this was the point of my talk. There's this thing called the 9 dot problem. I don't know if you've heard of it. what it is you put up 9 dots, right? 3 by 3 dots, right? And then you tell the
Okay.
person, hey, you need to connect these 9 dots using 4 lines, and the 4 lines need to be continuous. And then you tell them, go ahead, try it. And 99% of people can't do it for some reason, right? And they always fail. And then what happens is they look at the dots, and then they try to draw the lines within the area that the dots overlap. So for example, right, you put the 9 dots in a square, and then you'll notice that most of the people doing this problem will attempt to draw the lines within the square in which the dots are found. Okay. And then what happens is, in order to solve the problem, you have to draw a line that travels past the square that the dots have made. And then once they do that, right, once you show people that, people say, oh my gosh, you're cheating, or why didn't you tell me I could do this, or something like that. And then they kind of are surprised or maybe even upset. And then you draw several lines that go past that area, and then you're able to connect all the 9 dots. And the point of that, what I was trying to describe at the conference, was that's what's called breaking frame. And so I don't think it's a good idea to discuss religion as like milk, or milk before meat. The thing I'm trying to, I guess, talk about is something more like what I might call breaking frame. So you have all these relevant pieces of information, and the point of the 9 dot problem is that when you are given information, your brain automatically creates a frame of reference in which all those items are relevant. And your brain does this to be adaptive. However, that same cognitive process can also put you in a trap, because the people who do the 9 dot problem, they create a frame, but that frame isn't sufficient enough to solve the problem. And so you have to break frame, you have to create a new frame. And then once you do that, you realize, oh, all this empty space around the dots is relevant. And it's not that it wasn't there before, you just didn't realize that it was relevant. And so the theme that I saw within all 3 talks that were given at the conference was, the first talk was about neurology and how our neural networks sort of create a representation of what we might believe, or what we might believe exists. And so expanding our neural networks is like creating a bigger map for us to view the world. And then with Nicholas's talk, his thing was about, well, let's not narrowly hold on to these frames, or these creeds. And then my talk was about, okay, well, you have all this information and you think this portion of it is relevant, but let's expand what might be relevant. And then maybe that'll give us a better frame that we can use to solve big problems.
That's a really interesting comparison that you brought up. I think that's really good, actually. Like having the dots were always there, the pen strokes were always there, but it's just that you didn't think about breaking outside of that frame in order to solve the problem, right? I guess I would ask you, what is your opinion on when you break a frame? Does that new framework, is that inherently or objectively superior though, or better in some way to the prior framework?
It depends. It's hard to say, because problems are so complex that it's hard to say. I guess you could say, so I'll say this and then I'll say something else. I guess you could say, if the new frame helps you solve the problem, then it was better than the previous frame, right?
For that problem, though.
For that problem, right.
Okay.
But on the other hand, though, and this is the point I was trying to make when I was bringing up Sam Young and Kate Kelly and John Dehlin. One of the things that they do, and the CES letter falls into this category too, when people get their hands on their work, and the CES letter I think is the best example. The CES letter is like 140 pages long, and they'll give you like, it's essentially a huge list of like all these things that you didn't know, and then you're overwhelmed with all that novel information. And then the traditional dogmatic frame that you had, in which you viewed Mormonism, is not broken. And then the problem with the CES letter is that it doesn't provide a new frame for all that information. It sort of just leaves it open-ended. And I'm not saying that the guy knew this, but that's what his intuition was. That's why it's such a great tool to dissuade Mormons. is you overload the subject with all this new information. You don't give them a frame of reference in which to interpret it, and then you just say, well, see how uncomfortable you're feeling? That must mean this is all false or something like that.
Mhm.
And then if you don't have a frame,
which is the frame of reference, right, that they're providing.
right, that's one frame of reference, right? And then what happens is either you adopt. So here's the thing: you either adopt a bad frame. Well, hold on. Let me back up. If you don't have a frame, it's deeply uncomfortable, and it's preferable that you adopt a bad frame than have no frame
You
at
have
all.
no frame. Yeah.
Right. And so people like Sam Young and Kate Kelly, they're 100% ideologues. And so the ideology that they have just fills in the gaps for the frame that was broken. And then they go off the deep end.
Real quick, on Sam Young, he's the one protesting out, doing the hunger strikes to get it so that bishops don't interview any kids, any don't ask any explicit sexual questions in any interviews. So I'm just curious, why would you throw him under that same ideologue part as Kate Kelly? Because I kind of saw him as kind of like a more reasonable, that like almost that all Mormons should be supporting type thing. How would you?
Well, okay, so I'm not saying that Sam Young isn't reasonable, but what I am trying to point out is that Sam Young's approach to this problem of, let's say, abuse of children within the church. I think he's trying to put his attention or put his finger on a problem, and I think that's great. But I think when it comes to like not the dogmatic, but the ideological underpinnings of what he's doing is he believes that activism is like the appropriate response to that. And not only that, but like his tweets and opinions about certain doctrinal topics they have a certain ideological lens that and look, we're all susceptible to ideology. And so I'm not trying to say that Sam Young is like not doing great work or that his effort is fruitful or fruitless or anything like that. I'm just trying to say, hey, let's see where your framing is bad and let's see if we can improve it.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, I just added that it seemed like Sam Young was using a good cause, like advocating for not having children get asked these questions and being accompanied. He was using that as his cover, like, hey, look, I'm doing a good thing. But then at the same time, he would like stand up in state conferences and start yelling things, and he would post all these very critical things of the church. And he seemed to be driven by a certain more bitter and resentful form of against the church, but I'm still in the church because I'm going to make all these changes type thing. But
yeah, well, it's hard. I mean, look at the example with my bishop, right? I was just trying to post an event on my Facebook page and look at the resistance that brought about. Trying to make sweeping changes on church policy and stuff like that is never going to be easy, and it's going to take forever. And I don't know why people don't realize this. Like, the church is a worldwide organization. It has a huge skyscraper, not huge, but it has a skyscraper that's its headquarters. Like, that's a lot of bureaucracy. That's a lot of red tape. And the church historically even does not change easily. And so getting people to change how they do certain things is super difficult, and getting upset over it and then resorting to activism, that to me just speaks volumes. Like, hey, you aren't capturing like how this is working, you know? And hey, man, I mean, I'm not against Sam's cause, right? It's a good cause, but I think, again, maybe his framing is bad and it needs to be improved.
Yeah. No, both of you made really good points. I honestly have not looked into Sam Young much. All I've heard is those positive views, you know, the good things that he's been promoting. So if there is some more extreme views he's putting out, or hostile views, I'm not familiar with it, but that's really interesting. I would also like to go back on the framing part then. So I just thought it was really interesting, like with the CES letter, like exactly what you said. Like, you basically described a faith crisis, right? Which is basically when your frame breaks. Like, all your views of Mormonism get shattered by Jerry Reynolds' list of, like, what is it, 100 and something.
knows? It's 140 pages.
140 pages or 140
Every
items?
sentence there's a thing that destroys your Mormon framework.
So it's like pulling
There's
out
like
one
200,000. I don't know.
pulling out one post at a time under your house, and then it collapses, right? And you're left without a frame. And like, to give Jeremy Runnels some credit here, this was his own house being torn apart. And the background to this story that kind of makes it like a legend is that he sent this to some CES director or teacher, and he was like, I need a response. And they're like, yeah, I'll get you a response. And then they didn't come out with the response after like several weeks. So he's like, all right, I'm posting this, I don't know, Reddit X Mormon or somewhere like that. And then it caught fire, right? And and then so after breaking that framework, or you're in a faith crisis, you don't know where to turn. And that's where I think Jordan Peterson, we had this whole debate, right, in episode 12 or episode 11 on Small Talk with the Lees. And it was, well, is this going to provide a better framework, or is this going to be able to help the framework survive, help you stay in Mormonism? Is it like, is this actually some Antichrist framework? Like, that was kind of the discussion there, right? I'd be curious to hear your views, Alejandro, and Justin, if you want to chime in.
On whether or not Jordan Peterson is
Helping
Antichrist,
the framework?
or helping the framework. Okay.
Yeah, on that framework issue.
I
So
think,
if someone reads the CES letter, is it like, okay, then you get the Jordan Peterson after that? Like, what? I don't know.
Okay, so I mean, I don't think you can make a connection. I'm not gonna make the claim that if you read Jordan Peterson's work, you're gonna not be dissuaded by or it's gonna answer any questions that the CES letter provides. But I think what's valuable about Jordan's work is that he brings to your attention things that maybe you didn't think were relevant, and they're actually very relevant. How does that relate to the CES letter? Well, one of the things that you can do when you read that is, first of all, you want to see if what the letter says, and see if you can reframe what it's saying, right? Because when he writes, when you start reading the CS letter, he provides several premises, and then there's his conclusion, right? And he builds an argument with each bit of fact that he presents. Some of his premises aren't very strong, and you can actually pick those apart quite easily. And so, and then others are stronger than others, right? But the temptation when you read that is, oh, this person's an authority, and what they're saying is probably truthful, and it's also logically consistent. And that's the framework within which you're reading that document. But what you can do is you can say, okay, well, let's see if we can break frame on some of these, and I think that's useful. The cool thing about Jordan Peterson is, when I discovered him, this was before his biblical lectures and before his political scandals. I was just watching his courses on psychology. One of them was personality and its transformations, and the other one was about his book, Maps of Meaning. And what he does is he takes old arguments and he breaks frame on all of them. And even frames that I had, I took psychology when I was in high school. I took AP Psych, and I hated it. And there was a specific, 2 or 3 reasons why I hated it. And then when I watched Jordan Peterson's first lecture about personality, he brought those up and said, oh, well, you might think this, and this, and this is why that's not relevant, or this is why that's not the most relevant way of looking at it. And I was like, oh, yeah, this is great. So I guess the wisdom that Jordan Peterson is providing is he's a really good example of someone who breaks frame on old arguments and old assumptions. And he doesn't necessarily answer your question, but he at least gives you an example that you can follow and practice, maybe breaking frame on certain assumptions that you had.
Yeah. Justin, did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, similar along what Alejandro is saying. That video that they sometimes show you where they're passing the ball back and forth in a circle?
Yeah.
And
they say count how many times. Yeah, and the gorilla guy walks by, but no one sees it because they're looking at the ball. And we're wired to see what we're looking for, right? So when if we have the ideology of a conservative, right? When we look at something, when we say, well, we're going to view it from, well, if they're working hard, they should get what they earned or whatever. So we're always kind of approaching it with these principles. So axiomatic starting points are everything. And Jordan Peterson, as Alejandro says, kind of helps to break those and reframe a lot of these religious questions from different starting points that we may have never tried before. So me personally, as a member of the church that grew up in this faith, we always look for, okay, are we keeping, the word of wisdom, or the word of chastity? Are we looking at pornography? Are we looking to do this, that? There's a lot of things we can check off. But Jordan Peterson kind of, sweeps that away and say, okay, sure, that could be important, but let's look at the bigger picture. Let's look at these narrative structures that really give us meaning and how we act and what we do and stuff. So I would say it changes it in a lot in that respect, while those other things such as the CES letter or Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins are giving you and helping you think of things a different way, but it totally just kind of shatters your previous framework, and it doesn't replace it with much except a few nice ways to look at the world, but it doesn't seem to really be that cohesive or comprehensive and stuff. So that's kind of my initial gut reaction to a lot of these types of narratives and frames and stuff.
And I think I'm not even trying to say here that you can't be happy and be an atheist, or you can't be happy and be out of a religion. I wouldn't actually make that claim, but I do know it's definitely psychologically disturbing, at least for many years, for people that do leave religions who have their framework shattered. And most people, a good majority, they've done surveys on this. They have a faith crisis survey that people have a really hard time actually finding
adjusting
a better life after that and adjusting to a new
framework. And
one of my criticisms of people like John Dehlin and Kate Kelly not so much, because she actually tries, but John Dehlin, for example, and he tries a little bit too, but I don't think
John Dellen's the Mormon Stories guy, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
He's not. I don't think he's as effective as Kate Kelly, but Kate Kelly I think is more effective because she employs ideology. So this is what happens. Let's say you break. Let's say your frames are broken, right? And Jordan Peterson talks about this when he talks about Nietzsche. He says, because Nietzsche talked about this. Once you lose your faith in a belief structure, you tend to lose your faith in all belief structures, and then you're left with like a type of nihilism. And then Jordan Peterson argues that one of the things that Nietzsche was getting at was that once Christianity undermined itself with its obsession with truth, right? People would lose
the scientific revolution.
Right. People would lose their faith in that, and then they would either enter this type of nihilism or they would be possessed by ideology. And then that's like the basis of Jordan Peterson's work. And I think that's super helpful when you're navigating this type of thing. If someone has a faith crisis, right, we have to be understanding, and we have to also understand there's two dangers, right? One is a type of nihilism and like inability to adjust, and then the other is adopting an ideology, which again is like that. It's an insufficient frame, and so we have to be really careful about that.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right on that. And the evidence points to that. That context specifically, if you apply that to Mormons specifically, like anyone that leaves the Mormon faith, you don't see them joining like the Catholics or the Protestants or some other branch. They pretty much straight go to like agnosticism or atheism, because all their frameworks are broken. And
I don't see. I see an attempt from John Dehlin and Kate Kelly to sort of create a community of ex-Mormons. Mormon Stories is obviously like a point of contact for a lot of them, and for Kate Kelly, ordained women was definitely a big group to which people could go to once they've experienced a type of faith crisis. But these groups, I don't think are sufficient enough to really. I don't know. It's hard to say. Because I'm sure if you'd ask anyone within that group, they'd say, yeah, it's great. But I guess the data that you're citing is something, is suggesting, oh, well, these people actually have a hard time adjusting.
Yes, yeah, that's what it shows. Very good point. And I guess full disclosure here, personal opinion, I honestly, I listen to Mormon stories all the time. I really enjoy the work that they do. We were driving down the freeway the other day with my friend. We're heading down south, and we saw the big billboard, and it's like, "Oh, faith crisis,"
Yeah,
you're
that's
not
right by my
alone,
house.
Mormon stories. They put it all up over I-15. You probably see it if you're anywhere from Ogden to Payson. But I really enjoy the work because I don't think of his thing as a community so much for me. It's more like he has a platform where he allows people from all sides. You got faithful scholars, and then you have totally anti. They invite Jeremy Reynolds on there, and then you have people with high-ranking leadership going on there and telling all their stories, their testimony, their childhood. That's the part I really enjoy. So I don't disagree, with anything that has been said there, but I just want to disclose I love listening to the stories that are presented because there's so many different points of argument on there. That's really nice to hear different points of view. And I guess kind of my beef with the fairs and farm works that's being done right now. That's kind of the old apologetics, right? Now we have the neo-apologetics, which would be like Gregory Prince, or would be like Jordan Peterson type thing in terms of Christianity. And my view is the fair and farms articles is typically where people will look after they look at CES Letter, and they'll think the problem with that is fairs and farms is trying to rebuild the old frame after it's been destroyed. They're going in and sending out the construction workers, right? But the house is already burnt down. It has to be rebuilt with new wood, I would say, and that's where I see the benefit of people like Terrell Givens, even if you want to put him out there, or Richard Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling. That's kind of the neo-apologetics I would describe.
No, yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that's why it's so important. The frame problem is so critical if we're going to approach like these big problems. Like think about this. Most missionaries are still reading Articles of Faith and Jesus the Christ, right?
The lectures on faith?
No. Talmage's work.
Oh, okay.
So Talmage's book, Articles of Faith, and Jesus the Christ. Those are still like in the approved missionary library.
In the library.
Okay?
We had Jesus the Christ. We didn't have the Articles of Faith one though.
And then I think miracles. What is it? The miracle of forgiveness.
No, that's gone. We had. They used to even have the like Relief Society one, but now it's just 4. They have the Jesus the Christ, and then the one by I think Ballard. It's the Pursuit of Happiness, and then they have the Pioneer one, Our Heritage.
Okay,
so anyway, sorry. Yeah.
So let's take Jesus the Christ for example. Okay, that book was written over 100 years ago, and we're still using it. And so we have these 21st century problems that we're going to be facing, and we can't. I mean, and not I don't want to criticize. Those works are valuable, right? But with as time passes, they become more and more insufficient, and so we have to start reframing how we start looking at these problems. One of the things that I really love about Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke, John Vervaeke is a psychologist as well at University of Toronto, and he has a YouTube series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which is super great if you really want to learn about philosophy and spirituality. One of the things that those two psychologists speak about is participating rather than or they call it participatory knowing rather than propositional knowing. So here, going back to the creeds, the church, and not just the church, but like all of Christianity right now is sort of obsessed with this propositional, I believe statements. If you want to be saved, you have to declare that Jesus is the Christ, etc. But what they focus on is no. You have to participate. You have to act it out, right? Belief is best determined by your actions.
Yeah, that's a great point. I really like. I think there's a quote, but I think it's Marvin Ashton. He's actually talking about something way more controversial, but we won't get into that. He says you could baptize a pile of sand, and it wouldn't do you any good. Basically, you would be the same as that pile of sand over there.
I thought Joseph Smith said that.
Maybe it's quoted from Joseph Smith. Oh, it was like Heber C. Kimball, actually.
Oh, okay. Was it him?
Heber C. Kimball. The exact quote is, he's saying people want this and want that, and what good would all this do to you? do for you if you do not live up to your profession and practice your religion. Not as good as for me to take a bag of sand and baptize it, lay hands upon it for the gift of the Holy Ghost, wash it and anoint, and then seal it up to eternal lives. For the sand will be saved, having filled the measure of its creation, but you will not, except through faith and obedience.
Yeah. Well, I think that's interesting because a lot of kind of along what you guys are saying with like those creeds and stuff, like a lot of members think that when you go bear your testimony, all you have to do is say like, oh, I know the church is true. And that's like the prime thing. You always have to throw in, the church is true. And it's kind of classic, like on the mission, they would always kind of say the same things. They have these really rigid, like, oh, make sure, you don't drink Coke, or I don't know. There's some a lot of weird.
I mean, it's not that it's bad, right? That's not what we're saying. It's just that it's not all there is to faith or to religious practice, just saying it, right? You have to be involved more.
Right. It's insufficient.
That's a good point.
Right.
It's not that these dogmas or these practices or even these professions of belief are negative. And in fact, I think it helps a lot with it. But the main point here is the acting out, the doing. That's way more important than just the statements and the creeds and stuff.
Yeah. And I think it could get to a point where it is bad. Like we're saying, there could be a point where you're so following a creed that you just lose sight of where it's trying to take you. But the issue here is we have to frame it for the right problem, right? If the problem's changing, if the problem is that we need to be a better person, then maybe drinking Coke or not drinking, well, actually Coke's not even an issue, but maybe following the word of wisdom or not, is that really the best thing to talk about being a good person? Right.
Yeah.
So we got to frame it with the right framework, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that that's really interesting about what's happening right now in the church, maybe not in the church, that's too specific. Maybe just within Mormonism, let's say. Someone recently published a version of the Book of Mormon in which they formatted the book as if it were like a type of screenplay. So what they do is it has extra wide margins where you can annotate things, and then each set of instead of it being broken up into verses, it's broken up into paragraphs of text, and then it tells you who is saying it and where it's being said, and that's how you read. And then instead of dividing the book into verses and chapters, it's divided up into events, and so you read an event and then you read another event. And I think that's really cool because this is what happens. We've been reading the Bible. Okay. Well, yeah, we've been reading the Bible and the Book of Mormon for a long time now in this verse by verse format. And the problem with that is, the benefit of that is it's really easy to organize the scriptures. It's really easy to memorize bits of information, and it's really easy to keep track of all the doctrinal points. Great. I think that's super beneficial. The problem with that, though, is that you lose just the simple formatting of the text. You lose the narrative structure of the text. And then people start to focus on, the scripture says this, rather than, what's the arc of the narrative, right? And then you can start, and here's a really good example. The Book of Mormon, if you read it at a verse by verse sort of a way, and then add to that Joseph Smith's statement that the Book of Mormon is the most correct book of any book, right? Mm-hmm. Well, then each verse that you read has a given amount of authority and weight because it's part of the correct, the most correct book, right? But then if you look at it, if you reframe it and look at it from a narrative structure, what's the first thing you'll notice? Well, the Book of Mormon is a tragedy, right?
Mm.
And so
ends bad, yeah.
Yeah, it ends bad. Everyone dies, right? And so that then changes the context of all the verses you're reading, right? And then you have to start deciphering, okay, well, the narrative of the Book of Mormon leads to a disastrous end. What was it about this that we can learn? What can we derive from this? What can we learn from this? And what will help us avoid that same fate? And that's the point of tragedy, right? You learn something from it. And so looking at it from a verse by verse perspective, you it's not that you lose that, but it's just not so salient to you. Whereas you take it from a narrative perspective, and then different things about the text and the meaning of each verses starts to change.
That's a super good point.
Yeah,
I
that's
remember,
wonderful.
I can't help but think of like, I was taking a BYU religion class, and it was with the founder of Joseph Smith Papers, one of them, Dirk Matt.
Oh yeah, I met him.
You've met Dirk? He's a cool guy. He's a funny guy.
Oh wait,
He is a cool
I think I met Robin Scott Jensen, the lead historian who's
Oh, okay.
following that.
Yeah. There's a couple of, I think McKay as well is on there. But yeah, he kept me entertained all night. I had an evening class. I never like even tried to fall asleep because it was super entertaining.
Yeah, he was
But
great.
he mentioned, it's funny, you always want to think what it's like to be in a ward with someone who's like super knowledgeable like him. And he talks about his gospel doctrine classes where they're all hinged up on this one word in this verse, and they're like, but what does this mean? And then he's like thinking to himself, well, actually in the 100 manuscript, it wasn't even in that manuscript, so don't need to worry about it.
Oh man,
He doesn't say that, but
that reminds me of, I was at this there's this friend of my wife, and she invited us over. Her parents were doing this presentation at a state conference, and for like 2 hours he was going off on this contradictory word he found in the Pearl of Great Price, and how he reconciled that. And I was just like, man, like, fair enough that you can talk about this for 2 hours, but like I just felt like it was missing the point. It was like so down in the weeds. I was like, I don't think that one word really matters that much if you look at the whole, the big picture, or like the meta narrative of the Pearl of Great Price and stuff. But that just kind of reminds me of that. And I was just like, man, this is really boring. I can't believe he's getting so into this one word, and everyone else was kind of falling asleep too.
Yeah, no, that great points there. But yeah, I guess before we close here, we've been going for I think over an hour, which really good topics. I guess is there anything we missed? Anything else? Last comments or anything we want to bring up, Justin or Alejandro?
Yeah, I wanted to bring up one last thing,
Sure.
which I think will tie up our discussion. One of the things that I spoke about at the conference was I brought up this issue of framing and breaking frame, and what do we do about that? And then I also pointed out that a lot of critics of the church maybe aren't doing such a good job at rebuilding frames. And so one of the things that John Vervaeke is currently working on, and I highly recommend you guys check out his work.
Yeah, remind me, John Vervaeke.
John Vervaeke, his YouTube series is called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis.
Okay. I think I've heard of that, yeah. Does he write books?
He has one book called Zombies in Western Culture, and that's about the meaning crisis, and it's more about it's about Domicide, the book.
Okay.
Which is something I talked about, which means like the destruction of your home. And he talks about like the point of that book was they noticed that the zombie was becoming more and more of a cultural symbol, and they're trying to explore what that means, and that's a whole other discussion. It's really cool though.
I'd be interested because I am definitely into COD zombies. So.
Oh yeah, no, you'd love that book. It's great. You can download it for free somewhere, which is nice.
Cool.
So one of the arguments that he makes, which I think is really cool, he does a lot of. John Vervaeke is a cognitive scientist, and his major work in the field of psychology is what he calls relevance realization. And he explores how our minds determine what's relevant, and then how we cultivate that relevance. And he goes in, technically into how that process unfolds. But he's also talking about spirituality, which I think is cool. And one of the things that he said that really struck me was that he was exploring what sacredness might be, or what it might mean. And one of the ideas that he put forward was that sacredness, one of the ways that you can describe sacredness is that which is always relevant. And so when people break these frames and it's time to rebuild them, which is not an easy task, the temptation is to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we can start approaching these problems like our Mormon belief, and we can start figuring out, okay, well, maybe this frame here is bad, we need to break it, but what do we replace it with? We have to start figuring out what's always relevant to us and what's always sacred for us. And for me, I think that starts with the home. the symbolism of like the home. Like the whole, my entire talk was about domicide and the destruction of home. And for Mormons, the sacredness of the home is like one of our biggest motifs and symbols that we have. And I think we'll do a great disservice if we ignore that. And so that's a good starting point. Figuring out like, getting our homes in order, making our homes a sacred place. And then John Vervaeke in that book, Zombies in Western Culture, he makes the argument that worldview is just an extension of the metaphor of home, and home is like a microcosm of like what your worldview is. And so getting that fortified is going to really help us, along with these like relevance realization practices, is really going to help us not only like break frame and create better frames, but like retain what's sacred and what's important.
That's really interesting. I was actually going to ask you after your talk, I forgot to, but that if that word domicide, destroying the home, if you meant that actually more metaphorically, like your home, it can be anything. It's your life, it's your existence, your meaning.
Well, one of the things I argue in that talk was within the Book of Mormon's narrative. People lose their home all the time, right? Within the first 10% of the book, people are displaced and wars break out, and people experience the destruction of their home. And yeah, to a certain extent, it's a metaphor, but it can be literal too, because when people feel disenfranchised and marginalized, and they feel that they no longer have a home, literally, they start to engage in these parasitic cognitive processes. And the argument that I made was the Gnostics and their view of let's say an imperfect, unwise creator that made a terrible world, that was a response to the domicile that they experienced in Greece or in Europe. And then
what was the domicide there? Like, what was the historical?
Oh, good question. So Alexander the Great conquered the known world, right? And so that's one cause of domicide. He just wiped out all those kingdoms and cities and stuff like that. And then after that initial domicide, over the course of several centuries, Alexander's kingdom or empire broke into 4 smaller kingdoms, which continually went to war. And so that just continued the domicide that they experienced. Same thing happens in the Book of Mormon, where these people experience a loss of home. And then if you start talking to people like Kate Kelly and John Dehlin, they'll describe their faith crisis in similar language. They'll say, oh, well, I no longer feel I have a home in the church. And so, to a certain extent, it's a metaphor, but it's also metaphorical symbols, let's say, always point to like patterns of a lived experience. And so there's a tight connection between how we experience our homes and how coherent and meaningful our worldviews are, and then how that's going to be a buffer to this impact, to like a bunch of let's say faith crises that are on the horizon.
Awesome. Thank you for summing that up. That was a really good summary and solution to the problem, I think.
Yeah, well, that was a very fascinating exploration of Gnosticism, Mormonism, Jordan Peterson, and all these other themes that run throughout. So thank you so much for elaborating on that and coming on the show today. It was very enjoyable.
Yeah, appreciate it. You made me build some new connections with all those.
Yeah, for sure.
No, thank you so much for having me. It was a blast.
Appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. If you enjoyed listening to this, please share and like it. And we're happy to hear your feedback and what other topics you'd like to hear. So thank you for tuning in tonight.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts. It's Small Talk with the Lees. And you can leave a comment and let us know what you thought of all our topics we talked about today. And if you'd like to see the 3 talks that were given at the Lobster Conference with on Jordan Peterson's work and Mormonism, check out the Facebook page. It's Jordan Peterson Latter-day Lobsters and Sorted Saints and the Restored. So, all right. It was a good episode. We appreciate you coming on the show, Alejandro.
Yeah, anytime.